You know, the emergency of COVID-19, in addition to changing everything for now, has enabled, some would say forced, a structural shift toward online learning. And it may be that changes are not temporary. Our panel of experts is going to explore and debate how the current new normal is going to help and possibly hurt attitudes about online education. Please welcome Rick Levin, longtime president of Yale University, former CEO of Coursera, and current Coursera advisor, who will be moderating this panel of experts.
Okay, thank you, Betty. It's great to be here at what is my 7th consecutive Coursera Partners Conference, and to see so many familiar names among the list of those who are participating. We have an interesting group of people here from different backgrounds to talk about a big question, which is, what is the likely impact of COVID-19 on the future of higher education? Unlike the panel this morning, we'll focus more on the long term rather than the near term, and we will try to look at both the question of what's the eventual impact on online learning, but also the overall impact of COVID-19 on the higher education sector. I'd like to introduce my panelists. We have Patrick Brothers, who's the co-CEO and co-founder of Holon IQ, which is a research firm. Many of you may be familiar with the research products they have around higher education and online learning in particular. Second panelist is Sharon Cardia, who is the Associate Dean of Public Health at the University of Michigan. And as I think most of you know, that is one of the programs that offers an online degree on the Coursera platform. We're very pleased to have Ted Mitchell, who is the president of the American Council on Education and is also known to many of us as the former Undersecretary of Education during the Obama administration. And finally, just to make things lively, my great friend and successor as CEO of Coursera, Jeff Maggioncalda, is going to join in this discussion and share his thoughts with us also. Patrick, let's start with you. Since you're in the business of gathering intelligence, what are you learning about the impact of COVID-19 on higher education? What's the sector feeling about it? And what can you tell us?
Yeah, thanks, Rick. I thought I'd start just by kind of zooming out and just reminding everyone, higher education globally is a $2.2 trillion market. If higher education was an economy, it would sit on the G7. And like all institutions around the world that large and that significant, we are all expecting significant change and significant adverse change in the short term. And the question, as you posed, is the long term. I just wanted to share a couple of kind of other data points. Pre-COVID-19, over 6 million students around the world were studying their degrees fully online. And obviously now, many more of that, most of the higher education market, at least those who are able to study at the moment. We did a piece of work a couple of years ago called Education in 2030 with our executive panel, which is a few thousand ministers, presidents, CEOs on what education might look like in 2030. And one of those scenarios was called Education as Usual. And what was interesting is, although nobody wanted to see education as usual as the dominant scenario in 2030, 50% of people still thought that education would be as usual in 2030. Fast forward to, say, 4 weeks ago, we ran our 6-monthly Global Outlook panel, and 60% of those executives saw education disrupted in the next 2 years, and 80% saw it disrupted by 2025. So I think, we've heard some fascinating insights through the morning and completely agree. And I'm sure Ted's got his finger on the pulse in terms of what institutions are thinking themselves. But there's a genuine expectation that what we thought might play out over the next 10 years will be accelerated over the next 2.
Terrific. Sorry, I won't mute myself again. Sorry about that. So Ted, you're on the front lines of this at the ACE. And by the way, for our international participants, ACE is the most broadly representative organization for institutions of higher education in the United States. It has all sizes and flavors of institutions. From your vantage point, Ted, do you see many institutions that are existentially threatened by COVID-19 and the economic consequences of it? How are they coping? And where the threat less than existential, what kind of actions do you think universities will take?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm really glad, Patrick, that you set it up the way you did, because this is not we tend to think about higher education from inside, from our own institutions, but when you put it together and you think about higher ed globally as being a member of the G7, it puts it in perspective as a major industry in the world. And I think while we do have our fingers on the pulse of what's happening in U.S. institutions and some abroad, that flip between the sector analysis and the individual analysis, Rick, is right where we need to take the answer to your question. So first of all, the sector in the US is under extraordinary pressure as a result of COVID. I'll give you just one quick number. A Midwestern system has spent so far over $400 million simply reimbursing students on room and board expenses over the last 4 weeks. That's money that no one expected to lose. That's money that has to come from somewhere. And whether you're a public institution or a private institution, the economic impact is real. We're already seeing layoffs, furloughs, et cetera. And that will have an impact not only in the short run, but in the long run. Is it an existential crisis for some? Yes. Short version is there's no doubt that in the US, among lower resourced public institutions and small private institutions, this will be a tough go. The federal money that has begun to flow to institutions will be helpful, but this is certainly not going to save the day. Yeah, well, I have to say, I think you're right. When I look around the state of Connecticut, where I've been talking to institutions, some of them are really quite challenged by this. Yep. Sharon, you're representing an unusual position in this very stressed economic environment, because during this crisis, of course, there's been tremendous public attention to your colleagues in the field of public health. I mean, every cable news network is interviewing Neil Ferguson and Jennifer Nuzzo and Mark Lipsitch, and of course, Dr. Fauci is on TV every day or almost every day with President Trump. So all of a sudden, public health is at center stage as a field, and people begin to appreciate the importance of it. Do you think that this is going to have a permanent impact on interest in the field? Will there be expanded enrollments and more public funding? What's your view?
Oh, I definitely think it's going to have a positive impact on the field. I mean, all of a sudden, public health is cool. Usually people think of public health and fluoridating your water, not about pandemics and what's your risk. I mean, even my mother is saying things like, are you practicing social distancing? And like, did mom ever even know that term? And I think that general sort of increase in people's understanding of some of these population concepts, like flattening the curve, I mean, that's a pretty sophisticated concept, and people's feeling like they're contributing to that. I mean, we're certainly seeing some increase in interest in terms of some of our applications, and when we send out queries to students, they are really hopping to get more, I'll call it grounded and useful information. We can see it in some of the current students that we have and what they're hoping to do. For instance, their capstone experiences in terms of funding. There's going to be a fair amount of funding on research on COVID, everywhere from economic impact to, what's the impact on human beings in terms of their lived experiences through it. I'm not exactly sure what the influx will be for education, but I could absolutely see a need for increased training. There's going to be a whole need for workforce training. So the next set of terms is going to be like stacking best practices, risk mitigation, because we're moving from this urgent phase to a stabilizing phase where we now have to kind of change the ways in which we've been working or interacting so we can still stay safe. But I do think that there's going to be a pretty wide impact from this current pandemic on public health and on many of the fields that go with it. I mean, there was a lot of mention of things like the science of well-being, people understanding the impact of being under this kind of stress economically and psychologically as well.
I'm sure Jeff didn't miss the implication there, which is if you're going to start trying to train many workers in the public health field out where they're working, of course, that sounds like there's some other opportunities for Coursera training courses from the University of Michigan in the very near future. So we'll be looking forward to that. Jeff, you have any thoughts about the general impact? I mean, you're talking to partners all the time. I mean, what are you thinking about the sort of broader kind of economic and social impact on universities apart from the online course, domain?
Right. I can speak from observation from our partners and a lot of our Coursera for Campus customers right now. But as and a lot of that's been discussed, I think one of the things that Matthew Raskoff touched on was something I'd like to just maybe put a little bit more of an emphasis on, which is, when I was 27, became the first employee and a CEO of a tech company, and for 18 years did that, and now here at Coursera, Rick, as you know, it's a dynamic place. I mean, being in a startup company, it's a dynamic place, and so everything about how you operate, how you think, has to be tuned to be highly responsive to a dynamic environment. And I think that Matthew really kind of touched on something in terms of, if you will, kind of organizational capacity to deal with change. I think the combination of a virus that is still, not totally well understood, that can come and go here and there. And of course, we'll be developing, I'm sure, science and technology to help deal with it. But I do think it's going to be useful for universities and colleges after this period of kind of emergency keep teaching to do what Matthew said, kind of pull back and say, okay, as we assess the near-term situation and how do we respond to that? That's one thing. That's just to sort of keep the lights on. But the environment is going to be fundamentally changed. And one of the ways it's changing is it will be more uncertain and more dynamic. And I think part of what schools need to be thinking about is, how do we make sure that we have, when I think about this at Coursera, how do we have feedback loops to understand what's happening with learners, what's happening with jobs? We're going to have a double whammy of a pandemic that's going to disrupt the delivery of on-campus learning, potentially for years and in uncertain ways, and recession, which is going to disrupt the economic opportunities for graduates. It's not clear how this is going to play out. And I think one of the things that will be wise for higher education to do is to really think about what processes and what governance mechanisms do we put in place to get really rapid feedback and be able to make rapid decisions now, and then have a longer strategic point of view about the future. And that's kind of what Matthew said, but that's something that is very natural to a startup company, might be maybe a little bit less natural for a multi-hundred-year or a multi-hundred-year institution.
It's a very interesting point. I'm seeing that right now around the issue of what are schools going to do about reopening in September. So there's a lot of thinking going on all over the sector about that. At least in the U.S., I haven't really focused internationally, but it's clear that there's tremendous need to interaction across the sector among schools and universities, and with other constituencies, other stakeholders. The staff that works at these universities, for example, not just the students and faculty. So it's a really challenging moment for that kind of thing. So maybe we can turn a little bit. Will anybody else have general thoughts on broader economic impact before we turn to online learning? Ted or Patrick, anything else you want to add?
I would just add that given the impact of the sector on the overall economy, we think a lot about learners. We should, but when we think about the impact of our campuses on their local communities, and reverse the impact of an significant economic downturn on families' ability and willingness to pay. I think that there's a dynamic around the value proposition of all of our campuses that is going to have a long tail to it that will be really important for us to think about going forward.
Let's turn a little bit to the sort of longer term disruption and how the teaching and learning will be repositioned after this crisis. You know, here in the United States, at least, and I sense in lots of places around the world, you know, we've seen as campuses shut down, we saw the professorate sort of migrate at light speed towards Zoom video to teach their classes. And my sense is it's, you know, this has been kind of a mixed bag, that because mostly professors are just replicating on Zoom what they do in the classroom. And that kind of works for discussion sections where you've got 15 Zoom pictures on front of you and you can talk to people. But, and I think the panel mentioned this morning, for doing lecture courses, you know, these folks are not migrating immediately to the best practice way lecture video, Coursera way, or those other educational platforms use, but rather just, you know, doing things as primitive as reading their script while they're talking to us, with no rules and nothing interesting, and no interruptions. So I'm wondering, what do we think the impact would be in the, you know, after we come out of this, and on faculty attitudes towards online learning? Will people be more reluctant to use it because they had bad experiences during the crisis, or will they be more excited about using it because they had good experience? I mean, what do you think the mix would be? Like, you know, Ted, I don't know what you're hearing, and Patrick, maybe you're getting some feedback as well. It'd be interesting to hear what you're thinking.
Yeah, so Patrick, I'll start if you don't mind. So I think the response among faculty has been, first of all, I think Sharon, you hit it. I think that everybody was just responding in the moment and just kind of getting something up, and now kind of dealing with the second order, and we'll have third and fourth order. You know, I think that people have been genuinely enthusiastic about trying it out, but I think that as the weeks progress, people, Rick, are beginning to understand that there is a difference between putting a camera up in your study and giving a lecture, and actually having a well moderated, whether it's a discussion section or a lecture course. I think the institutions that have had a head start, including Coursera partner institutions, have gained ground against the objective. Institutions that are starting flat-footed are having a tough time. Mm-hmm. And I think that is having an impact on faculty attitudes. I think as this is going on, faculty who don't have institutional support, who don't have the capacity to change, that we've been talking about a little bit today, they're suffering. And I worry that there will be a backlash, that there will be too many faculty who will be able to say, when the dust settles, I tried it, I didn't like it, it didn't work. Mm-hmm. And so the more that all of us can do to help faculty grow as they go through this, I think the better off we'll be, and the better able we'll be to make the transformation happen.
Yeah,
Patrick, go ahead. Yeah.
You know, I'm reflecting on a couple of things, and I'm actually quite optimistic after spending the morning hearing the panel sessions and all the new products that Coursera is releasing. I think, you know, I don't envy being a university president. I think it would have to be one of the most challenging leadership roles that's happening at the moment, given not just responding to the crisis, but given all of those impacts that we talked about: jobs, faculty, remote, students, people's lives and livelihoods. Like that I do not envy being a university president right now. But, and not just having to respond urgently, but also having to respond strategically. You know, I think that universities are about to go through what a lot of other industries have been through by way of the sharing economy. And I think Coursera for Campus is just a perfect analogy, metaphor for that. if I had finite resources, if I knew my funding was going to be waning, if I was going to be in survival mode for a period of time, but wanting to prosper in the long term, I'm trying to encourage, the university presence I'm talking to, that, your secret sauce is not your economics 101 slides. Your secret sauce are your professors. They're your faculty. They are your secret sauce. How do you find the talent or the expertise, or through what we heard about this morning, the scaffolding and the structuring, such that you can deploy your secret sauce, effectively? And that's what we're hearing from learners as well. They don't want to be on Zoom for hours listening to someone talk, just the same as they don't want to be sitting in a 100-person lecture theatre. I love that quote this morning of, the third row qualifies for distance learning. I think that's what I'm trying to encourage at the moment in my conversations. It's hard to be strategic right now. There's no doubt about it when you're in triage mode. But I think much of that risk that we all fear of coming out of this, and the consumer and the faculty deciding, I tried that and that didn't work. There's too much pressure on higher ed already. Tuition, access, sustainability before this as well. And so I'm really encouraging them to think as much as they can with the headspace that's left. Think strategically and act strategically right now. Don't wait for the end of something that we're not really sure when it's coming. So the only other thought is that it's relying on a few universities to be brave and to take the lead as well, not to, as we heard through a few of the sessions, remain in competitive rankings mode. I think if there was ever a time to be brave and to take the lead, it's now.
Rick, I'd like to introduce Sharon. The first time we met, Sharon, before COVID, was basically taking a public health degree online with the faculty. I don't think, Sharon, any of them had taught online. I don't think. And they went through a process that wasn't really easy. And then this is before there was any external pressure that required it. It was a few visionary faculty and leaders who said, we want to do this for the world. Mm-hmm. And I would love to hear, Sharon, what your experience was and how with the faculty, like what was it like at the beginning, the recognition, going and building it, and then teaching, and now what's happening there, and how do people feel?
I think we were really well positioned. I mean, it did sort of surprise everybody when we got the order that we had to go remotely, but we already had probably a third of our faculty thinking about online, thinking about instructional design. And so when we pivoted, we basically created training materials on the spot, got faculty to either come in remotely themselves or did it live, showed them the controls, and then got them to think about a few things not to do an 80-minute lecture. Or for instance, we had some faculty doing 3 hours at a time, and we were like, break it up, make them work together. So we actually had what I think was a really good community response. We surveyed the faculty probably every 3 or 4 days about what did they need, what barriers were they hitting, and then what did they want to share with their other colleagues about what was working. And so then getting that information back out to people so people could avoid some really, I'll call it difficult moments. We didn't avoid all of them. We had one faculty member decide not to proctor an exam. So he was going to disincentivize cheating. So he shortened the time for the same exam. It was like, oh, that was not a good idea. So we learned both the hard way, and then we also learned some great new practices. I would say probably 50% of our faculty are leaving this with a positive sense of more can be done than what they thought. Probably a quarter of them are still like, the technology doesn't work. I couldn't get the feeling from the students that I usually do. And then there's probably another quarter that are right now on the, I'll call it on the fence. What we're really looking for is to start now to work with those faculty and actually all of the faculty that have to teach in the fall, so that we can get a much more resilient teaching portfolio, so that they could go hybrid and do some residential, some online, pivot when they need to, but getting them to think about strategically, what do I want to change in my class so that it can actually be developed and then delivered in a much more effective and engaged manner, both for them and the students.
Yeah, and Rick, another thing that I think is becoming really obvious, as with individuals and with companies and remote working, is that there are certain institutions who have a huge advantage. In particular, for instance, Michigan, where Sharon's from, was a founding partner of Coursera. So back in 2012, they began building an institutional capability to author courses and then degree programs and master tracks. And now there are hundreds of courses from Michigan on Coursera. So there's a lot of institutional knowledge. And the institutional knowledge is actually incorporated in an entity called Academic Innovation. It's a Center for Academic Innovation. This is a team that in 2019 was 100 people strong. Their job is to not only teach professors about instructional design and provide the technology and support, but they actually also build up capabilities in each school to do their own academic innovation and online. So Michigan has a centralized academic innovation team of 100 people, and then they are actually teaching each school how to build their own mini version of that kind of a support unit. And then the president just fairly recently announced a grant of $50 million more to really double down on this. This was pre-COVID. So you've got some schools with hundreds of people and tens of millions of dollars dedicated to building institutional capacity for online learning. And then you have a lot of other schools who maybe have one person who is, kind of reading strategic, papers and kind of just thinking about what the future might be. And I do think that almost every institution, even if it is just a handful of people, having some centralized capacity to understand what does it take to build this type of online capability, and what are the best practices that everybody's learning, because we're all learning so much and nobody has the answer right now.
Hey, and Jeff and Rick, I hope you don't mind if I jump on Jeff's comment and connect it back to something that Patrick said a little bit ago, is that I think that if you think about those institutions that have one person or two people, and what are they going to do strategically as they think about this situation, and think about, honestly, and Sharon, you got it, that we will be thinking hybrid for a very long time. And probably not just because of the COVID, because it's a really interesting model and probably, when done well, effective. So is that one person shop hopelessly behind? And I think what Coursera for Campus provides is an alternative answer to that, is no, that you don't need to provide the capacity to build all of this stuff. What you need to have is the capacity to understand it and utilize it in a way, Patrick, to your point, that takes advantage of the secret sauce.
And Ted, I think to that point, one of the early panelists on the Coursera for Campus panel said, we're going to start right now by selecting courses to supplement, and we know that we're going to start building our own courses. But the thing about it is they get a lot of support until they build that capacity. They don't have to build the capacity by fall, because they can take advantage of that support. And I love that bridging analogy.
Yeah, good, interesting. Let me go to one other potential area of interest, and we'll take some questions. I think there's been a lot of talk in Washington, and I think the situation surely in Europe will be similar, that there will need to be, because of the economic displacement caused by this new recession, a lot, more subsidy for training and training of those with jobs and getting them back to work. I know this was kind of a passionate area for you, Ted, when you were in government, to expand sort of vocational oriented training. Now, as most of you know, a lot of our universities have actually done very practical skills-based courses that have had a big impact on the labor market. And I wonder, do you think this downturn will provide an ample opportunity for Coursera partners to start building vocationally oriented, career-based courses for those kinds of learners, specifically, not at the population we've been focused on, which is the 18 to 22-year-olds, but for the 25 to 40-year-olds. What do you think, Ted?
Yeah, I sure do. And I think in two ways. I think that the nature of the downturn is such that people will need to be re-skilled and retrained for the jobs that emerge, because this will not just be a cyclical but a secular change in the structure of the economy. So there will be a need. Second, and I think quite significant, is that vocational training and learning has typically been focused on bricks and mortar institutions. And I think that we're seeing that shift. And I know that a couple of the questions have been about how to engage in simulations and sort of virtual experiences that mimic the workplace. And I think that Coursera is in the process of developing those with partners. And I think that provides a new opportunity for what has been a very long problem. On the government side, the government is eager in Washington to provide resources and is looking for the best way to do that. It's one of the places where the Labor Department and the Education Department seem to be working together to great effect.
That's useful, particularly to know, because as you know, you were kind of frustrated as Undersecretary of Education when you tried to broaden the definition of eligible training provider, which meant institutions that could receive government subsidy. Coursera didn't qualify under the old rules. Only bricks and mortar institutions basically qualified for
That's right.
Training courses. Presumably that'll change. Do you think so?
I think that will change within the next 6 months.
No. Fascinating.
You know, Rick, I think there's another dynamic that is about to accelerate dramatically, and we hope to facilitate it, which is, if you look at the 4,200 courses that have been published, especially from the universities, they're some of the best kind of theoretical, conceptual frameworks around understanding a discipline or some domain of knowledge, which is, of course, going to be more durable than specific skills or specific tools. We see a world with these projects where companies like local employers can build projects. You can build I built a project. That's why we put it in the keynote. Like, I built a project on how to teach employees how to set their objectives and key results, and how to use a piece of software called BetterWorks. But these projects are so easy to create, and you could use real skills and data sets to do it, that we see a world where companies build projects that are very job specific, very tool specific, very task specific. And then we link them with the skills graph to the courses. So you can learn the theory from the best minds, and you can apply that using the actual tools of the trade, maybe in a project authored by a local employer. So we're hoping to facilitate an industry-university collaboration where the universities do what they do best, and that's advance the domains of knowledge. And industry does what they do best, which is kind of like, how do you apply that to get some job done using certain tools? And we're really optimistic that our content engine is going to actually embrace both the knowledge frontier with universities, as well as that hands-on skilling that can be authored by companies.
Interesting. Let's take a couple. I've got questions here on the thread from the audience who might want to consider. I mean, one, I think they lost track of who it was, but one of the questions is kind of relevant to what you're saying, Jeff, about industry-university collaboration, and irrelevant a little bit to what Patrick was talking about maybe this will be an impetus to more course sharing through vehicles like Coursera for Campus. But I think the question is more general, which is, will the COVID-19 crisis induce more collaboration among universities? Will the fact that we've all faced this common challenge actually make universities going forward more inclined toward collaboration? Anybody want to handle that one?
God, I hope so. I mean, credit transfer is just too far. It's really hard, and I on the learner's behalf, like we need a better system. I think course sharing seems, especially given the emergency we're in, such a logical place to start, especially at the foundation level where the content differentiation really isn't that high, and the secret sauce is the professor. And we see a lot of debate in higher education around outsourcing, where there's, not every institution has taken the initiative that, say, Michigan has and built that incredible internal capability. And for the most part, universities would actually prefer to collaborate as a network or on a platform, but can't seem to get past the competitive dynamic in order to do that. And so I'm super hopeful and optimistic after this morning, thinking, well, maybe the upside out of this crisis we're in is a forcing function of collaboration, where universities are starved of more, resources than they would like, or we would like them to have. But the upside out of it is more collaboration and more sharing on the non-secret source components. And on the scaffolding pieces, where if you don't have a team like it sounds like Michigan has built, you can kind of lean on that in the again, not plugging Coursera for Campus too many times here, but lean on the expertise that has gone into the development and the refinement. And we heard from the machine learning teams, like, it's a constant feedback loop as well. And it just, to me, it seems illogical not to strategically take advantage of that resource and then, point my incredible talent towards the learner in the understanding sense-making component.
Yeah, Patrick, I think you're right about the imperative, and I'm bullish about course sharing. I think that it's going to happen. I think that it is, we're in a moment of punctuated evolution in that, and I think that institutions who take advantage of this moment are going to prosper. Those who don't, I worry about a lot. And so I think that in the end, the secret sauce will be the faculty ability to break down and discuss and provoke questions and comments from students and engage in the development of projects, whether those are technologically mediated or not. That is the secret sauce, and I think that we're going to get back to that rather quickly. We've done this before. Textbooks are the old version of this exact conversation, right? Is that textbooks are a distillation of high-level common understanding of a field of study, along with whether they are quizzes or border discussion topics, the teacher's manual. We're just doing it far more efficiently. We're doing it aided by AI, which means that the turnaround time on revisions is going to be spectacularly short. So I think everybody should just relax about this issue of course sharing and domestic content production, and just use the tools that we've got now.
Mm-hmm. Sharon, Michigan's one of Coursera's most prolific partners, so you're likely to be on the expert side of sharing. But do you think even an institution like Michigan, with its size and scope, would be likely to use courses coming in from elsewhere?
Oh, I would say that we're going to use anything that's high quality and that fits the bill that we need. There's already the group of Coursera degree partners that work together and figure out best practices and how to sort of, mount, call it good approaches across the different universities. I would also say that this is a time period where across schools and colleges within a university, many people don't think of big universities as actually being a lot of separate colleges, but we need interdisciplinary work even more than we ever did. Our ability of school public health to reach out to a school of information and their data science, or a college of engineering and their computer science to build apps for, symptom screening for an entire state. We actually need many, many lines of connection to be built in order for this next jump in kind of education and its evolution for things like the pandemic. Public health gets called out because it's clearly in our domain, but it affects all of us. And this is really a time period where we ought to be sharing and basically pulling from others all the time.
Great, thanks. By the way, to give proper attribution, that question on sharing and collaboration was from Francisco Noguera. So I see that now in my thread. Here's a question that actually relates a little bit to stuff earlier this morning, but also to something you alluded to, Jeff, in this conversation, from Brenda Allen. You know, the commitment to social justice, and clearly this is a situation where disparities are going to be highlighted post-COVID, and the recovery. You know, the recovery is, as if it's like any other economic recovery. You know, the well-to-do are going to bounce back more quickly than the less well-to-do. And so, you know, what is there anything Coursera is thinking about at this point that should sort of demonstrate it would really highlight our commitment to social justice and equity? Are there things that we can do through our courses, through our practice, through partnerships that may, you know, deal with questions of health disparities or economic disparities coming out of this crisis?
Yeah, I think, you know, Daphne kind of got us started on the right foot, talking about access and quality, essentially, and the ability to deliver a better experience, a learning experience, a more effective learning experience in a way that's more accessible to more people. That's a question of like technological access, but also financial access, and sometimes even sort of literacy access. So I think that from the very beginning, when Daphne and Andrew started the company, they were definitely thinking about social justice and equality. She mentioned financial aid. I mean, from day one, there's been financial aid for individuals who can't afford, you know, the $49 for an open course. We started Coursera for refugees before I got here, and that's been going on for a long time. We've reached 40,000, and by working through institutions, it really gives you a lot of opportunity to get leverage. So the way that we've approached social impact, and by the way, I want to recognize that we have a huge a kind of opportunity and responsibility. The marginal cost of delivery to a fully online course is quite low. The value is quite high. So finding populations who could benefit from that, you can serve people at very low marginal cost. And I think we have a duty to serve people. So working through institutions to serve refugees, working through institutions to serve veterans and their families, working through institutions to serve formerly incarcerated people, you know, with Coursera for Campus and this coronavirus initiative, working through the institution of a campus to serve displaced students. And you'll see another big announcement coming this week, a very large announcement from Coursera of another major initiative where we think we can make a social impact. Because, you know, here in the Bay Area, I hate to sort of just amplify what people are already saying, but the level of inequity is just extraordinary. First of all, you know, do you have access to digital tools, bandwidth, compute power, and cameras? And that's the first sort of digital divide. There's a second digital divide, was which skills and job do you have? Do you have the kind of job that could be done remotely or not? And then there's a third level of digital divide. What kind of a company do you work for? Do you work for a company whose business model is mostly digital, or a company whose business model is mostly not digital? And so you actually have kind of compounding layers of inequality, and which are going to be growing if we and our partners, if the full Coursera community doesn't come to bear on this problem of growing inequity, yeah, I think that it's going to get worse, not better. And so we're going to do everything we can, and our partners have been fantastic in their generosity to say, yep, we're going to step up with you, and we're going to try to help as many people as possible.
Any other closing thoughts from any of the panelists? Okay, well, I think we covered a lot of ground. I do want to thank the panelists for interesting observations, and thank those in the audience for their questions. And over to you, Betty. Next phase.
Thank you, Rick, Patrick, Sharon, Ted, and Jeff. We're in for a wild ride, whether we want to be or not.